When it comes to our metabolic health, our blood sugar, our insulin, is all we have to do pay attention to just carbs and fats and proteins? No, there is so much more we can do to help optimize our blood sugar and metabolic health, our energy levels, the amount of fat on our bodies, and so much of this has to do with not what we're eating, but things like light and grounding on the earth and sunlight. And so I'm super excited to bring on Carrie Bennett, who is one of the people who I've been learning from so much lately about all these circadian and quantum strategies that I am starting to share with you guys now on the podcast. And these words can sound overwhelming and some of the science can feel a little bit confusing, but I promise you that this is just, you're going to be hearing about this because it is unlocking these new levels of health in myself and in my clients. I share some amazing wins that my clients have had inside of my blood sugar mastery program where I'm starting to teach these concepts. And I wanted to get Carrie on the podcast because she is so good at breaking this down to make it really understandable. Even if you don't understand every word, we talk about these important takeaways that you can start incorporating now in your lifestyle to start having more energy, better blood sugar, improving your insulin, improving your hormones, improving your fertility, reducing inflammation, slowing down the aging process. I mean, literally everything, because this is getting to the root of the root of the root, which is what quantum is. Quantum is these tiny, minuscule particles. So like talking about electrons and protons, like bringing it back to 8th grade biology or, these terms that we haven't thought of, but that are so powerful in our health. And so many of us are used to talking about nutrients, and we talk about vitamins, and we talk about minerals, and we talk about healthy fats, and we talk about carbs. But now we're going to go even deeper than that. And what this is going to allow you to do is have a little bit more resiliency and just start to feel even better, because I feel like so many of us, we start applying a lot of these things. I see a lot of people and they're like, yeah, I went to this functional doctor and I'm definitely feeling a little better, but are they feeling like really good, robustly healthy, so much energy? They're not. And so starting to incorporate these strategies will be game-changing for you. And it might not happen day 1 or 2. And some of these things take a little bit longer to see some of the results. But my client said she had, after day 1 of putting on blue blocking glasses at night, she's falling asleep within a couple of minutes instead of the hour and a half it's taken her to fall asleep for decades. So let me introduce Carrie Bennett. She and I have an amazing conversation all about metabolism, blood sugar, insulin, this newer hormone called leptin that I'm learning about, and so many more ways to optimize your energy and also improve your hydration. And it's going to be totally different than what you are used to hearing when it comes to hydration. So let me read Carrie's bio. As a college athlete, supposedly at the pinnacle of health, Carrie began suffering chronic joint issues and insomnia. After her first child was born, she developed debilitating stomach pain, adrenal fatigue, and brain fog. That sounds familiar. A lot of people I know struggling with those issues. Armed with a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Master's of Science in Nutrition and certifications as a personal trainer, massage therapist, breathing coach, she still couldn't find the root of her issues. And I think this is super relatable nowadays, right? And that is when she found quantum biology. Now, as an online educator, clinician, and faculty member of the Quantum Biology Collective, Carrie's mission is to teach her clients how to create a healing environment by applying quantum health strategies around light, water, electrons, and mitochondrial support. Don't be scared of these words, guys. We're going to explain them and it's going to sink in. Given these tools, clients who have spent years trying to improve their health, just as Carrie did, finally experience powerful healing and lasting benefits. And that is why I'm so excited to bring Carrie onto the show today. You can find her at carriebwellness.com. That's also her Instagram. She's got tons of online courses. I have taken many of them. And I am also going to be studying at the Quantum Biology Collective with Carrie this spring, because this is how excited I feel about all this information. And I literally can't stop learning about it. It feels like every day is Christmas Day when it feels like Christmas morning every time I have the opportunity to learn about this quantum biology. And so I want you guys to please give it a chance. If you have liked the content that I've produced in the past, you're going to enjoy learning about these strategies because they are going to up-level your health. So without any further ado, let's bring on Carrie. Carrie, thank you so much for coming on the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. It's an honor to have you as a guest today.
Thanks, Danny. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yes. So I have been learning so much from you, from your page, from your courses, all about circadian and quantum biology, quantum health, and it's these new terms that I've been sharing in the past couple of episodes of the podcast that I'm just like, my mind is expanding and my mind is blown on a regular basis from some of the things that I'm learning from you. And it's like I can't unlearn this and I can't not share this message and add this to what I'm teaching about. So hopefully today in our conversation about metabolic health, you guys will understand just why I'm so excited about this information as well, because I think it's so empowering because there's so much we can do that goes beyond that traditional paradigm of obviously allopathic medicine, but also functional medicine. So let's start with your story of how you got involved in all this quantum stuff about, easy water and mitochondria and all this stuff that sounds kind of intimidating.
Yeah, totally sounds intimidating. It's not when you break it down, but I got into it because I think the way all of us found our niche in terms of supporting our health, and that is just for my own health issues myself. So, I think I've always had some health challenges, nothing that was super obvious. I had really loose joints as an athlete, which was not great as a volleyball player or softball player, not a great thing. And then, I became a mom and it's like, I'm not feeling great again. And that's when, after probably about, 2 weeks postpartum, I started to experience massive digestive issues that really set the stage. Yes, insomnia was a thing then. I kind of just assumed, that's just run of the mill here, being a new mom. And so, yes, my sleep was garbage. My energy in the morning was just completely tanked. And my digestive health was so bad that I couldn't even eat like a quarter of an avocado without being doubled over in pain. And so I was like, something's got to give. There's got to be something that I'm missing because at this point I had already had, I've already went through massage therapy school. I had an undergraduate degree in biology. I was a personal trainer and I owned a wellness studio, right? And so it's like, what am I missing? And I knew nutrition played a big role. So that's actually the direction that I went first. I mustered up enough energy to put myself through a 2-year master's program in clinical nutrition. And I learned a lot, right? All good information, but it didn't move the needle enough. I had to be very restrictive with what I was eating. I felt okay, but I still felt bloated a lot. I noticed these energy crashes, and my sleep was still garbage. My energy wasn't great. And so I said to myself, this can't be as good as it gets, right? I'm not just going to settle for, you're a mom now, and so suck it up, and this is how it is. And so I was scrolling on my phone one night, and I don't recommend that anymore. Do not do that. But I was scrolling on my phone one night, and I came across a blog from Dr. Jack Kruse, who is kind of a neurosurgeon and really is the founder of this term that we call quantum biology. And he was talking about the things that I think you've probably been talking about lately on your podcast, which is my light environment and how different light signals, both in my eyes and on my skin, impact my health. And this was such a new concept to me. And so I, just like you, I got the bug and I dove deep. I'm like, I want to know everything I possibly can about this. And I started to apply it. And no joke, within 3 days after applying it, I felt better than I had in probably darn close to a decade, 3 days. And I can now say that I have no gut issues at all. I can eat whatever I want. I choose not to eat, certain things. But back when I would have just a tiny little bit of gluten would sneak in and I would be doubled over in pain for hours, fatigued for days, bloated, just, not feeling great. Now, if gluten gets in, I don't even notice it, right? And so it just is so freeing. And this wasn't because I did a very intense 5R protocol to heal my gut. I tried all that stuff. This was because I was working on my light environment.
So cool. Such a cool story and great segue to all the things we're going to talk about, because I think so many of us feel that if we are struggling with our blood sugar, that it's all about like carbs and fats, and that doesn't leave us feeling really empowered, because it's like, okay, cool, am I never going to eat this stuff again? And then on the other side, it's like, do I have to be so restricted my whole life? Like, do I have to micromanage every single drop of food that goes in my mouth? And that's one of the things that restriction piece has been sort of coming up. And I feel like I'm like, there has to be something that's going to increase our resiliency. And of course, these aren't going to be things that we're going to be doing every day, because then we're going to be right back where we were, right? So, but I'm excited to learn and incorporate all these things, and I have been incorporating it and just getting more of that resiliency, because we're just building up health from the cellular level and even beyond that on the quantum level. So let's start out with understanding metabolic health. I talk a lot about blood sugar and insulin on this podcast, but there's other hormones involved and there's other processes involved. And so what are we missing when we're just really focused on, what we're seeing on a CGM and what our fasting insulin level is?
Yeah, I mean, those are interesting things to track, right? I think it's important for us to do that, absolutely, because we learn about our bodies. But that being said, I think that there's some even more foundational hormones or numbers that kind of almost run the show. And then below that, even, I want people to know that from a quantum perspective, we actually only get about a third of our body's energy from food. And so when I found that out and started applying these other, what I call free energy gathering strategies, that was a game changer for me, because, yes, we need to eat, we need nourishment, we need vitamins, minerals, the building bones of our physical tissues. We absolutely need that. But I think that when I maxed out on the other sources of free energy, that's when my body truly was in the energetic state it needed to heal and now thrive. So, I mean, where do you want to go from there? Because I think that there's a lot that we could dig into.
Yeah, so let's talk about what are these, well, I like how you said our bodies aren't getting the energy they need from carbs and fat. That's not like the energy currency. So maybe we can start with what the energy currency of the body really is. So how does food even turn into energy?
Yeah, and it does. And so food does turn into energy, but like when you pick up any traditional biochemistry textbook, you'll see carbs and fats break down ultimately into electrons, and those electrons go to the mitochondrial electron transport chain and they become ATP. And our assumption is that we need ATP in order to run the whole entire cellular process, basically to have optimum cellular health. And we now know that, yes, ATP is important, but actually there's an even more important thing that gets produced by the mitochondria in that electron transport chain process, and that is water. And when you understand how water functions in the body, you realize it literally is a battery of energy. It causes proteins and receptors to function, take the correct shape. It allows biochemical reactions to happen at really quick efficiency. And so when our mitochondria aren't making water, then that's an issue. And we actually now know that water, which we can, I guess, go into details about in a little bit, but that water actually is what gives our cells a healthy charge. Every single one of our cells has a negative charge to it, and that's not bad, right? That's a good thing. It's basically a cell that's full of electricity and vitality. And when we don't have that vital negative charge, when it starts to drop, those cells in the research are associated with cells that are inflamed, even cancerous, right? That's not a state of cellular health and thriving. And so when you look at the state of the body from this angle, from what's happening with the water in my body and the charge status, this negative charge, you realize there's so many more ways we can essentially derive energy besides just the electrons from food. We get electrons through earthing, right? Touching our bare skin to the earth, the surface of the earth. That's what happens with lightning discharges. Lightning discharges electricity back to the surface of the earth. So we get these beautiful electrons from the surface of the earth into our bodies, and they can go anywhere. We've got this beautiful capability as human beings to literally suck up electrons. And if there's a cell, over here on the tip of my finger that needs that charge, it can flow there. If my red blood cells are stacked together and clumped together, meaning they're also lacking charge, it can flow to them, and they can start to be these beautiful red blood cell life rafts that carry nutrients throughout the body. And so if we look at it from that perspective, what I call the quantum perspective, it's like, yes, food matters, but wow, there's so many other things we can do to support our health.
Yes, so cool. So that idea that we are getting energy from electrons, we need to maintain this negative charge to all of our cells, and that these electrons have a negative charge so we can step on the earth. And there's also, we can also get electrons from the sun. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's two ways that we could talk about that. So number one, that water inside of our cells is very special. Have you talked about easy water at all on the show?
Let's dive into that. Yeah, okay, I know you love easy water, so saving it for you.
It's my favorite topic, yay. It is my favorite topic because this was my big aha moment, both in my personal health journey and then also as a clinician. And so when we think of water, I was taught that it comes in 3 different stages. Yeah, drinking that water, right? Yeah. It comes in 3 different phases, right? It can be a solid, which would be ice. It can be a liquid, such as the liquid water you just drank, or it could be a gas, which would be steam. And it turns out that the water inside of our bodies, the vast majority of it is none of those phases. Yes, we have some liquid water. It's in our blood, right? So that our blood can flow. It's in our lymphatic system and our cerebrospinal fluid so that they can flow. But when it comes to the water inside of our cells, it actually takes on a state that's really resembles Jell-O. It's like a gelled state of water. And for water to be able to do that, it actually has to rearrange itself. And so I want people to kind of work with me on this. Like, we all know that water is H2O, right? These really basic molecules. And that liquid water in a glass, if I were to zoom in on how these H2O molecules were interacting with each other, they would be kind of random, right? It's like, I'm going to bond over here, and they slosh around, right? They change partners, they shift and they move. That's how water can maintain a liquid state. If I were to look at how the water is interacting as ice, it would be rigidly organized, right? Like H2O is all organized in very crystalline format. So it'd be a very rigid organization. And the water in our bodies is in between that. It actually has some wiggle room in our cells. It has some wiggle room like a liquid, but actually it's organized very much in a crystalline state. So the H's and the O's interlink to form these hexagonal sheets. And it's just a natural property. This just naturally happens in our bodies anytime water comes into contact with our biological surfaces, like these water-loving surfaces inside of our cells and on the outside of our cells, just in our body in general. And when we actually look at the water and we test the water in terms of charge, if I were to take a charge tester, right, basically an electrode, and put it into your glass of liquid water, it would be neutral, meaning the protons and the electrons, the positive charge and the negative charge, balance each other out. They essentially cancel each other out, and it's neutral. When I measure the voltage or the charge in this water that's inside of my body, if I were to stick a little tiny electrode, which can be done, right, into this what we now call exclusion zone water, that's the water that I'm talking about, easy water inside of our cells. If I were to stick a little meter, it would have a negative charge. So now we realize, since the cell is full of this water, and this water is what actually holds negative charge, we now know that in order to maintain this healthy voltage inside of our cells, we need adequate amounts of easy water. And that happens, yes, because we drink some water. It happens because our mitochondria make water. But when sunlight strikes our skin, and sunlight doesn't just stay at the skin, certain wavelengths of sunlight penetrate all the way into our bodies, and that would be a certain portion of the light called infrared light from the sun, which you were bragging about before we got on here because it's very warm where you are, and I'm still in Michigan where it's cold. So you got plenty of infrared in your environment, and that infrared penetrates deep into our bodies. Yes, it warms us, but the water inside of our bodies, that easy water, actually pulls in the energy from infrared light, and it causes that water battery to expand. So all of a sudden, if a cell is depleted of negative charge, it actually uses the energy from infrared light to build that charge back up. So I mean, come on, right?
Yes.
That's why I know I got bit by this quantum biology bug like you have, and it's like, I can't look back. This is just such cool information.
Yeah, it's so cool. And so with the easy water, that's that negative charge. And then on the other side of it, it kind of like pushes all the protons to the other side. So it's making this like positive, negative sort of gradient. And that is what conducts electricity, right?
Yeah.
We're very electrical, you know? And
that's what all biochemical reactions are. That's exactly it. Like everything in our body, from the protein, what's happening with proteins and receptors, to even hormone signaling, to biochemical reactions, it's all being able to create the flow of electrons. Same thing with the mitochondria. And you're right. So in order for that exclusion zone water to become negatively charged, it had to have kicked out a positive charge, a proton. So they realize now that yes, you've got these zones of negative charge, and right next to these zones of negative charge, you have these zones of positive charge. And when Dr. Gerald Pollack, who is the researcher who really discovered all this, when he took what are called little sensors, little electrodes in his lab, and stuck a little sensor in the positively charged zone and a little sensor in the negatively charged zone, and attach it to a light bulb, it lit the light bulb up. It really is electricity. And so that's basically, if we stop viewing our bodies as calorie consumers and we start viewing our bodies as electrical beings, and we need to maintain adequate electricity, charging our batteries with things like infrared light on the skin and earthing, well, I don't know, I feel pretty empowered.
Yeah, because a lot of that stuff is free, right? So, getting out for sunrise, that's free. And, taking light breaks throughout the day, also free. And so I think I lost you there for a second. Okay, I think we're back.
Yeah, we're back.
So this exclusion zone water, we need it to conduct electricity and to maintain this negative charge of all our cells. So we talked about how to start gathering energy. So grounding, sunlight on our skin. Anything else?
Movement. I view exercise differently than most. And I'm trained as a personal trainer, fitness instructor, right? But I view movement as another way that we could actually charge up these batteries with electricity, because our connective tissue, which is the fascia, would probably be the most common way to call it. Our fascia, which surrounds every single muscle, has the ability, when we move, to create electricity for us. It's a property called piezoelectricity. And so literally movement to me is maintaining this beautiful electron charge because of this inherent property built into the fascia.
So cool. I never, thought to look at movement like that. And the idea of it hydrating our cells in a different way. So we look at hydration really differently. So what would be some signs that someone has like cellular dehydration? And so and just sort of contrasting that with how we think of like, oh, I didn't get enough water.
Yeah, sure. So some key signs for me would be the way that the body, I think, is most responsive to cellular dehydration. I see nowadays, especially in the past 3 or so years, I'm seeing a ton of histamine issues related to cellular dehydration. A lot of people don't realize that histamine actually is what we would call a drought management hormone in the body. And so as soon as the body starts to sense dehydration, histamine levels go up. And so I don't know about you, but I see a ton of histamine related things these days. And so it could be as simple as supporting hydration. Another one I see that's really common is tissue stiffness, because a tissue that doesn't have appropriate movement to it, or like, let's say we always have knots in the back of our neck or things like that, that's tissue that is going to have less exclusion zone water in it, because exclusion zone water gives tissue elasticity, appropriate, not excessive, not too little, but appropriate, what we would call length tension relationship or elasticity. So that's another one. And then anytime, I hate to say this, but anytime you have a diagnosed disease, it is likely that at least part of your tissues is lacking in this exclusion zone water or this cellular hydration, because this exclusion zone water, we know, can also almost even act as in an antioxidant capacity, because we can flow electrons through it, and electrons are actually what antioxidants are. Right? Antioxidants have electrons to give to calm inflammation. And if we can do this simply by having adequate hydration and touching the surface of the earth and things like that, it means that if we're having chronic inflammation or a diagnosed disease, likely that in and of itself is an indicator that we don't have adequate exclusion zone water.
That blew my mind when I heard it first, that like we are getting antioxidants and anti-inflammatory, like electrons are anti-inflammatory, because when you said, I had to like put my phone down because I was watching your course, and I was just like, are you kidding me? I like threw my phone that you said inflammation is excessive protons. And I was just like, are you serious? So this idea of gathering electrons and going out of our way to do all these things to gather electrons, we're providing antioxidants and anti-inflammation. I think we all have that in our mind. We're like, oh, this is good because it has antioxidants, and this is like an anti-inflammatory. Like, we're thinking in supplements, we're thinking in food. And so if we can expand our mind to think about how every cell is getting these things, not just taking like some turmeric supplement from Amazon that's probably loaded with deuterium. Like, that's, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But, it's, yeah, so just a different way of looking at things. And so I have a question. Would someone who struggles to sweat maybe have this like cellular dehydration as well?
Yeah, it's a great indicator for me that someone either their mitochondria aren't making adequate water, because the water that the mitochondria make is what it as soon as it comes into contact with a surface inside of the cell, a biological surface, it's going to structure itself into exclusion zone water. So either they're not making adequate water in the mitochondria, they're maybe not absorbing the water that they drink, or likely it's both. And that's because this exclusion zone water, when it's adequate, it's basically a cell that's full of gel. And when it's inadequate, and let's just picture that this gel is kind of shrunk, it allows what we would call bulk water to come in. And bulk water, that's just regular liquid water. It means a cell that's too waterlogged, doesn't have enough of this gelled water, it's got too much of this liquid water. And unfortunately, with the liquid water can come things like toxins and intracellular infections and mycotoxins and heavy metals, right? And so the reason why it's called exclusion zone water is because it excludes things. And so as soon as a client is telling me that they can't sweat, it means they don't have enough of this liquid water that's basically being pushed out of their cells. It's still inside of their cells. They're not making enough of it in order to push it into the lymphatic system and essentially out via the skin. And so it's a really good sign to me when a client who wasn't sweating before can start to sweat again, because it means all of a sudden these exclusion zone water batteries in their cells are now replete, they're full, and that means that the bulk water is able to be eliminated by the body.
Amazing. Super interesting. I just have an endless list of things I can ask you, so I'm going to try to be on target with this. So I guess would maybe some other modalities that maybe aren't free, so some things like red light therapy, sauna, like what are some other things that help us increase this exclusion zone water?
Yeah, those are two great options. So red light therapy works specifically on the mitochondria, on that step of the mitochondria, step 4, where water is made. And so, can I get a little nerdy here? I know I've gotten kind of nerdy already.
Please, hold on. Let me put on my Carrie nerdy glasses. Okay, there we go.
Here we go. All right.
I'm ready for it.
When we have there are things that can block water production or impair that water production in the mitochondria. And it's anything that causes the cell to make excessive nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas, right? And we need to make it in certain circumstances, such as when I breathe, I want my paranasal sinuses to make nitric oxide so I can dilate them and bring the air in. I want my blood vessels to be able to make nitric oxide to regulate blood flow. When I make too much of it inside of my cells, nitric oxide actually jams up that step 4. And in order for that nitric oxide to get cleared, the body needs red and near infrared light. And we would make excessive nitric oxide inside of the cells because our immune system can do that for us to clear toxins, clear infections. Not excessive non-native EMFs do that, so excessive Wi-Fi exposure can do that too. And so what that means is we really need, if we feel like this step has been bogged down for quite some time and we're dehydrated on that cellular level, it's a body that is begging for more red and near infrared light. And red light therapy panels can be a great way to deliver that to the body. But remember, sunlight has it as well. Sunlight has those frequencies as well.
Yeah, especially around the time of sunrise and sunset. Is that right?
Yeah, it's more if they're there always. Red and infrared is there always, all throughout the day. But if you are someone who's like, wait a second, I was taught to avoid the sun. because it's damaging, then you want to start to build your relationship with sunlight when there's no ultraviolet at first, because I think you just need to understand how important this light is and how good you can feel. So yeah, go out at sunrise from the first hour or so, or two from sunrise, hour or two before sunset. Those are really, really rich in infrared and red, and you can just bathe your body in those and allow your mitochondria to start making water again.
Awesome. So we talked about things that can add to easy water that can help increase it, but what are some major depleters of easy water?
Yeah, so that's what, in terms of those non-native EMFs, I hate to say it's a tough one to wrap our brains around.
I tried to get my house hardwired yesterday, and the guy's like, you'd need 2 modems, and you can't do that, because I'm just like, oh my gosh, this feels so impossible, and it feels overwhelming, and there's like a tower right over there, and I'm just like, okay, I got to mitigate, I got to do the best I can. I have like a Defender shield on my phone now. Yeah. Like, I'm just trying, but it does feel hard. So, why route her off at night?
Yeah, it feels really hard. It does. It feels overwhelming. And so I like to break this down for people, because non-native EMFs, I want you to think of wireless or Bluetooth radiation. And I sadly use the word radiation because I want people to know that it's a form of radiation. And you do the best you can, because it does. It prevents it can damage the mitochondria's ability to make water, and it can also just by itself shrink our exclusion zone water batteries. And so what can we do? Well, it made me be very aware of what I'm wearing, right? I don't have a wireless watch anymore. I don't wear wireless headphones. Those sorts of things now, yeah, exactly. Everything is wired. And so I realized how important this was. And so that's just a non-negotiable for me. I'm always going to use some stuff that's wired. It also means that if possible, where you spend the majority of your time, try to make that wired as well. So again, I've got like a wired mouse here. I got a wired, it's like old school, super old school. But when I had everything wireless and I took my meter, you can do a EMF meter, it was off the charts, like insane. And I knew that I would be spending hours and hours here. And so, yeah, I mean, we still have Wi-Fi on in our house, at parts of the day. We turn it off at night. But at least in this workstation, I've got an old school Ethernet cable, and it looks ugly. It's running through the ceiling, down the corner, right? But do the best you can. And I always say, try to unplug your Wi-Fi router at night. You can go to techwellness.com. Also, August there does a great job of educating with this. And she has what's called an EMF kill switch. So you can literally essentially attach that to your Wi-Fi router and just push a button at night. And so it's like before bed, turn it off. First thing when you wake up in the morning, if you want, turn it back on. But that way, at least you're not sleeping in your house that has non-native EMFs or wireless radiation that close. Yes, your neighbors might have it. You can't knock on every door. I put a kill switch on, although I want to. It's like, okay.
Oh, I want to too. My neighbors across the street had these white and blue LED Christmas lights, and I'm just like, this feels like, and here's my like red bedroom shining across. They probably think like, who knows what that girl's up to in there. And it was just such a funny juxtaposition that like these white and blue lights are shining in my house every night. And good thing I have these like 100% blackout shades and everything like that. But I mean, it was just, yeah, like around my neighborhood, I'm like, oh no, they put in new like front porch lights, and they're so bright. And I'm like I need my blue blockers to walk around my own house, which is pitch black or red or whatever, because of we live in a neighborhood. I can't move to
control it.
The middle of nowhere. So I love your saying, and I hear Sarah Kleiner say this too, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good,
That's exactly it. You do the best you can, right? You do the best you can. And yes, it doesn't mean that when my husband and I sit out, I like to catch sunset, with him on the porch whenever we can. And there comes a time when everyone's like, sun is set, everyone's lights come on, and I just have my orange tone blue blockers near me. And it's like, that's when I know, plop them on, right? And
yes.
What really is obnoxious, just as a rant, street lights and headlights.
The worst. They're all LED now. They're blue. Yeah.
I know. They're just intense. So do the best you can, right? Yes. Don't drive with orange tone glasses on. It's not safe, but do the best you can. And so that's the same thing. It's just like, now I know, like when I'm taking a walk with my phone, if I want to have my phone with me and let's say listen to a podcast, I download the podcast and put the phone on airplane mode, right? And it's like, okay, I still have my phone in case I need to. and I need to call someone, it's an emergency or whatnot, but I'm not just holding radiation all the time. So little things,
there's little things you can do. There's all those hacks with like apps on your devices that we can turn them red. And so I think we talked somewhat about light in other podcasts, so we won't go into that as much. But I wanted to circle back to, if this feels like the right time, to metabolic health and the hormone that I feel like has been missing from the blood sugar conversation, which is leptin. So I did talk a little bit about this with Kira Lee, but I would love to chat with you about how this fits in. And you specifically talked about in one of your courses about how it affects people who have like hypoglycemia, who can't go long periods without eating. So can you take us through leptin and help us to sort of ground this in maybe what we do know about blood sugar, and make it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Leptin is a cool one. It's like, I consider it probably the main hormone besides cortisol and melatonin, which set the circadian rhythm for us, daytime and nighttime. I really view leptin as a key hormone that pretty much almost no one's heard of, and definitely not tracking these days. Yeah. And so leptin is a hormone that we release from our fat cells, and it docks into our brain in the hypothalamus, in the same place that insulin can dock, right? And it's a communication mechanism to say, Carrie has this much body fat on her body. It's designed to happen between meals, and it's designed to happen at night, as long as we're asleep with the appropriate circadian signaling happening beforehand. And when we allow leptin to be released from body fat and dock into the hypothalamus accordingly, it just downloads a lot of information. And it's going to do things like say, okay, let's let Carrie not be hungry right now. Let's suppress her appetite because she just had a meal. We just processed a meal and she's got this much body fat, so we're not in a state of starvation. So let's just go ahead and allow her to be satiated for X amount of time. Let's then, because we know how much body fat is on Carrie's body, let's optimize her body for fertility. Oh, wow, Carrie has more body fat than we got in the communication. All of a sudden, we're getting leptin signaling again. Oh, we can burn this body fat through things like brown adipose tissue activation, which is how, in the mitochondria, we can generate heat essentially and burn it off. And when this communication mechanism happens regularly, then the metabolism kind of naturally falls into alignment. Our blood sugar falls into alignment as well, because when leptin can dock, basically, that's when the body says, oh, okay, now we can do things that stimulate lipolysis, which would be the burning of fat, right? The breakdown of fat and funneling that fat to the mitochondria to make more water and more ATP. And when this signaling is impaired, you can imagine how then, if we're not able to essentially make these communications and then utilize fat effectively as a fuel source, we're really reliant on this blood sugar roller coaster. And that's where it's like, what's going on with my blood sugar? It's crashing here, and I'm gonna have hypoglycemia all the time, or I get this surge and then a big crash, or it's just staying elevated all the time. That to me primarily indicates, yes, insulin's an issue, absolutely. Yes, your blood glucose is an issue, but let's talk about leptin and circadian rhythm.
Yes. So should we start with what dysregulates leptin? Like what prevents it from docking? And then what happens when it doesn't get that chance to communicate? What is the brain sort of thinking then?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about leptin, because there's two ranges of leptin. There's high leptin, which would be leptin resistance. So we could have a ton of leptin in our bloodstream, but if it's not docking to the receptors, it's very synonymous with what happens with insulin resistance. And so we can have this elevated leptin for leptin resistance, and we can have very low leptin. And if the body fat isn't releasing leptin, it's very low, then we're also not going to get the communication. So in one aspect, the receptor isn't receiving the signal. In the other aspect, we're just not making enough leptin in the first place, because and so there's reasons why that can happen. I see both. In a high leptin state, in a leptin resistant state, the primary things that I'm seeing that are impacting the ability for leptin to dock, number one, it is circadian rhythm. Simply because leptin does its main download at midnight, but it only does that if the symphony of hormones leading up to midnight is appropriate. And that symphony of hormones is darkness, that produces melatonin in the pineal gland that signals the onset of sleep, that causes the release of human growth hormone and other repair programs. And like, it's like this beautiful crescendo and symphony that needs to happen. And then leptin docks and says, oh, okay, so this is how much body fat we have to dedicate to repair processes during sleep. And this is how we should regulate Carrie's appetite the next day, right? And so all of that stuff is coordinated, and the main download is at midnight. And so you can imagine if we're kind of watching a screen or scrolling late into the night, or our sleep is disrupted because we have a lot of light coming in from the curtains, between the curtains, or if we're not in bed by midnight regularly, like all of those things can really drive leptin resistance. The other thing with leptin resistance, and then I guess we can chat for questions, is frequent eating, frequent meals, which it's one that I know sometimes people need to eat more frequently as they're working on all the things to regulate their blood sugar. But if leptin really needs about eating a meal, leptin needs about 4 to 5 hours in order for us to fully digest the meal, the body fat to then release the leptin, and then the leptin to dock and communicate a download of energy information. And if we're eating very frequently, meaning we're getting these little surges of insulin regularly, because insulin and leptin compete in the brain for a similar communication. It's like insulin, if insulin's communicating, leptin's not going to be. So then you have insulin out competing leptin, and so the body assumes, if leptin's not docking, the body assumes it's starving. And so it says, well, we don't know how much fuel is in the fuel tank, so we might as well stop at every gas station along the way and tank it off a little bit, to top off the tank a little bit, so that we can make sure that we at least have some energy in reserve.
Yeah, so it'll send you, so if the leptin doesn't communicate with the brain, it'll say things like, why don't we increase our appetite tomorrow because we're probably starving, and maybe we should, increase her anxiety because we need to really make sure she's going out and getting fuel. So you can start to see, oh, there's a lot of those symptoms of hypoglycemia, this like, I need to eat all the time, I have anxiety, I can't go long periods without eating. It starts to be because the leptin is not telling the body that it's safe to be burning body fat. And so I always talked about this from the standpoint of insulin, that when insulin is low, when insulin is high, it blocks the body from using any stored energy. But there's also the leptin piece that I didn't know about, that I'm like, okay, I have to go and rewrite everything I've ever written. But it's okay. So we're going to add on. But I think that this is a really cool piece, because it then tells us, okay, what's the framework in which we should have the timing of our meals, because we don't want to be spiking our insulin that's going to be competing with leptin. And what about our light environment, because light is that important. So maybe you want to jump in here?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for leptin, we do know that one of the best things we can do for timing is to have breakfast, which sometimes goes against the modern idea of fasting, right? Intermittent fasting. It's like, oh, let me just kind of drink coffee up until 2:00 in the afternoon and then break my fast. And that actually is a really good way to drive leptin resistance or low leptin, kind of depending on one's current body fat and stress and nervous system status. It'll go one of two ways. The other thing is absolutely indicative of the light exposure we're getting, because excessive blue light at the wrong times will actually elevate our blood sugar regardless of whether we've eaten food or not. And this is this is hard for, I think, people to wrap their brains around. But we've got a signaling pathway in the body where if blue light, excessive blue light, unbalanced, I'll call it, like the type we get from screens and light bulbs these days, if we get that light into our eyes, it basically initiates this cascade, starting with a chemical called POMC in my brain, that ultimately results in the production of ACTH and cortisol, which are, they help to tell my liver basically, hey, make some new blood glucose, right? They're going to go tell the liver to do gluconeogenesis to elevate blood sugar. And so I can be fasting let's say, but at night, if I'm staring and watching a movie without eye protection, without, orange tone blue blockers, then I might as well be eating a bowl of popcorn or worse, probably a bowl of ice cream or something like that. And because my blood glucose is going to be elevated anyways, and so I tell people that you have to be aware that our metabolism is so tightly tied to the type of blue light that's entering our eyes and the time of day that we're getting it. Not as necessarily impactful during the day because of the fact that if we were outside, we'd be naturally getting blue light signaling, right? That wouldn't have been a huge issue during the day. But prior to sunrise and after sunset, that artificial blue light can be very, really just deranging to the metabolic signals, especially involving blood sugar.
Yeah, it's such a big component. And then also the impact it has on our sleep, that when, I have a client, she's like, one day after I put on these blue blockers, I was falling asleep right away instead of the hour and a half it used to take me to fall asleep for decades. And it's like, yeah, the orange blue blockers can do that. And then, we have everyone change around their whole, home environment and all these things. But even just starting with a pair of orange blue blockers is huge. And I had such a cool, actually, that reminds me of just such a cool win of my client who has MS. She said that she used to struggle to walk after 2 p.m. and then by 5 p.m. she had to be in bed reclined, again, no energy in her system. And then she started incorporating all the light strategies and all these circadian strategies and grounding that I'm teaching her. And within a month, she's up and walking past 2 p.m. She was up at her coaching call, cognizant, beautifully, speaking at 8 p.m. and her red lights are in the background. Her screen was red. She's got her glasses on. It's just it's so cool how the body can just, heal itself. And I know that MS is really, really linked to light because we see that increase in incidence over the 37th parallel. But yeah, so super cool with this light stuff and as it relates to our blood sugar. And I think there's a study, I don't know whether it just came out, probably not, it's probably been there for a while that we haven't, it hasn't been mainstream, that red light can actually lower our blood glucose levels. How does that work?
It improves mitochondria's ability to utilize glucose as a fuel source, right? And if those so in the same way that blue light, that unopposed blue light can cause our blood glucose to elevate, it also jams up that step of the mitochondrial electron transport chain where water is made. That's the final stage where electrons need to flow through. And if it gets jammed up there, there's going to be a backlog. We're not going to have really efficient mitochondria, meaning they don't need electrons from glucose to burn. And so all of a sudden, when you liberate that step and you give it the red and near infrared it needs to optimize the mitochondrial electron flow, that all of a sudden you can the cell will want to metabolize glucose more. So the GLUT4 receptors and things like that will be more responsive. The electron flow literally is more efficient, and it's all because of the light frequencies.
Amazing. It's just so cool. So many different strategies. So one of the things that I think that I haven't fully dialed in yet, that is my next step in my own health journey, is that I really want to embrace local and seasonal eating. And can you explain why this is so important, especially as it relates to our blood sugar?
Yeah, sure. So light in our environment is a signal, and we utilize it as a signal both to tell the time of day because it's changing, right? The light at sunrise looks very different than the light at noon, looks very different than the light as the day goes towards sunset, right? It's a very different thing in terms of where the sun is located, the brightness, and also the colors of light that are coming out. And the same is true of time of year, meaning my light environment on December 30th looks way different than my light environment on June 30th, right? There's a huge difference. And it's not just it's all of a sudden just poof, it changes. It's a subtle shift in either an increasing intensity of light or a decreasing intensity of light. And with that, my brain and even my gut microbiome is so intelligent. it knows when it can anticipate the fact that plants can grow again, produce can grow. It can anticipate the amount of glucose that is going to be available. So, for example, my gut microbiome, if I sync my circadian rhythm up all summer long, my gut microbiome in the beginning of spring says, oh yeah, I'm ready for like the spring onions and the asparagus and those little tiny strawberries that you can forage. And it's like, I'm ready for those types of carbohydrates again. But then come August, it's like, whoa, here we go. We've had so much strong sunlight. Now I know that I need to be ready for more fructose rich foods. So it's like, okay, give me the squash, give me the apples, the pears, all of those much more fructose rich foods that in my environment, at least, and this is different in everyone's environment. So that's why if I learn how to eat seasonal and local, not only is my blood glucose responding and my mitochondria responding accordingly because they're tied to the light environment and these metabolic signals are really on point, but even my gut microbiome is responding as well because it's changing with the seasons and recognizing when I'm going to have more carbs in a certain season versus anticipating less carbohydrates in another season. And so if I can start to at least try to eat seasonally and locally, it only makes sense for the metabolism based on these types of factors. And then there's also deuterium, which we can talk about at some point if you want.
Let's talk about deuterium. Okay. Yeah, I haven't talked about that either, and I'm also just dying to learn more about it because it sounds like, what the heck is this word? It's crazy. It seems like a weird thing. But
all people need to know is deuterium is a form of hydrogen. Like, listen, they should have called it hydrogen 1 and hydrogen 2. But they call quote unquote normal hydrogen protium, and they call this other version of hydrogen deuterium. And before we can understand how deuterium might be impactful, like negatively impactful to the metabolism, let's talk about where we need this protium hydrogen number 1. This protium hydrogen is what goes into the mitochondria in a place called the inner membrane space. So as electrons are flowing through the mitochondrial electron transport chain, there's these channels that are pumping protons. And these protons, hydrogen, if you go back to chemistry class or if you look at the periodic table of elements, hydrogen is the first one, right? And it basically is just a proton and an electron. But in the mitochondrial electron transport chain, the electron gets donated to the electron transport chain. And this proton, this hydrogen, this naked hydrogen, essentially, that's just a proton, goes into the inner membrane space. And we need enough of these protons to build up. It's almost like this balloon that's blowing up a certain amount of pressure in that inner membrane space, because then that's going to drive these hydrogens to flow back into the inside of the mitochondria through step 5, the ATPase, and that makes ATP. And we want this all to function. We want the electrons to flow to make water. We want, as the electrons flow, we want these naked hydrogens to go into the inner membrane space, build up this pressure gradient, and then want to go back through and make ATP. So it's this beautiful cycle. The issue becomes if we're, instead of having a protium hydrogen in that space, we get a deuterium. And that's because that ATPase, that step 5, is literally a spinning turbine. It's a motor that spins, and it's picture almost like a water wheel that's capturing these protons, these hydrogens, and as it captures it, it kind of propels it more. We want and it's really dependent on the size of the hydrogen. If the difference between a regular hydrogen would be 1 basketball, and a deuterium would be the size of 2 basketballs, because deuterium is not just a proton, it's a proton plus a neutron. So literally you get double the size of hydrogen. That's going to jam up this ATPase. And so if you're not making adequate amounts of ATP, you again backlog the whole system. You're not making the water, you're creating more inflammation. More inflammation can signal things like hoard fat. Let's become mildly insulin resistant because we don't know what's going on, right? There's a lot of metabolic damage or chaos or inflammation going on. Yeah. And so how does that tie to seasonal eating would be that the deuterium comes from carbohydrates, right? Glucose is a chemistry C6H12O6, right? So there's 12 hydrogens in each glucose molecule, and some of them can be deuterium. And depending on where we're located, the deuterium matches with the amount of light that we have in our environment. Meaning, if I live in the tropics, tropical fruit has a lot of deuterium, but it wouldn't be a bad thing because we got ways in the tropics to deplete that deuterium. We deplete it in sweat. We can actually hold it in our exclusion zone water. We can hold that form. It's a very safe place to hold it. And in the tropics, we got a ton of infrared, right? So we can't help but step outside and start to make a lot of exclusion zone water. So that's great if you're in touch with your light environment and the temperature environment of where you live. If you're like me, right now, there's not a lot of infrared heat. However, if I went to the grocery store, I could eat any tropical fruit I wanted. I could have tons of sugar at any time of the year. And that just means that I'm loading my system with deuterium and I don't have a way to sequester it and deplete it. And so that deuterium makes its way into that inner membrane space and can jam up my ATPase. And the research there is actually, I want to say unfortunately, but it's good to know that it's alluding to how that deuterium can really damage the mitochondria to drive cancer. And so it's a big enough deal for that research to be going on in the world. And there's a lot of research. I mean, deuterium, a strategy called deuterium depletion is an approved veterinary cancer therapy in parts of Europe. So I know. So this is, just another thing. So like if I eat seasonally and locally, I'm eating food that has an appropriate amount of deuterium for my body to handle at any given time of the year.
Wow. So how else besides sweating? So I'm just like infrared sauna keeps coming to me as like, wow, this seems like such a great tool to deplete deuterium, to get the infrared, to expand exclusion zone water, sweating out toxins just in general. So what other strategies can we use to help deplete deuterium besides not consuming it?
Yeah, sunlight. Yeah, that's the thing. It's just being aware of what we're consuming. And so fat is going to have way less deuterium than carbohydrates. So recognizing maybe you shift the balance of that seasonally a little bit, if that's sounds like a good strategy for you. And then I'm a huge fan of sweating regularly, especially, but the sauna is great. You're right, but you could exercise. I think it's another reason why exercise is beneficial. Getting our body into the sunlight, because when we can get that infrared light exposure, we'll sequester it, we'll hold it, right? Even if we don't sweat it out. And so just think about maximizing infrared exposures, and your body should be able to, as long as you're not really in a seasonal mismatch with the amount of deuterium you're consuming, your body should be able to handle it just fine.
Cool. Okay. I love this. Love this information. Okay. A couple more questions if you have a few more minutes. I would love to, and I know we don't have too much time, but I'd love to talk a little bit about the adrenals, because I have a lot of people who struggle with adrenal fatigue or adrenal issues, especially the low functioning adrenals. And then we have the people who just have high cortisol and then their blood sugar is high all the time. And how can we look at this better through a quantum lens? Because I feel like in the mainstream, they're like, you don't have Addison, so get out of here. We don't believe you, that you're not tired. You're making it up. And then in functional medicine, it's like, we need to do all these adaptogens and all these things to support the gland itself. And so that is not where we need to aim, right? So let's talk through a quantum lens about our adrenals.
Yeah, sure. My grandpa had Addison's disease, so I understand, right? There is such thing as your adrenals completely failing and you need to rely on, exogenous hydrocortisone the rest of your life. When I was in the throes of the worst of my illness, I was diagnosed with stage 3 adrenal fatigue, which is completely flatlined cortisol. Yeah, I was probably on, I was on 3 pill boxes, because it was my morning supplements, my lunchtime supplements, and my evening supplements. So handfuls and handfuls. And I didn't feel like I was thriving. Not to say that they didn't do anything, but no one ever told me about how that whole hormone signaling pathway happens. And what I know is when we get appropriate light signaling, we can't help but start to stimulate appropriate cortisol responses. Meaning, at sunrise, the light at sunrise has the perfect blend of blue and red light. And that, I got little sensors in the backs of my eyes waiting to capture especially the blue light. And once it captures a certain amount of it, essentially the amount at sunrise, my hypothalamus starts its communication pathways, which people have maybe heard of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. There's the HPG, so hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis or reproductive organs, HPT with the thyroid, even HPP with the pancreas, right? There's an axis that gets kicked off there, which anyone who's interested in insulin, right, that's a key thing to know. But coming back to this whole idea of cortisol is that as soon as the hypothalamus perceives this a little bit of this blue light, it all of a sudden tells the pituitary gland to tell the adrenal glands to start to make cortisol. But that actually can get downregulated if the signal is always missing. It can also get downregulated if cortisol is high all the time, because again, we don't have a healthy morning circadian cortisol surge. And instead, we're getting random cortisol surges all day long. That's not how we're designed to make and release cortisol. We're designed to make it in the morning in response to this initial pathway that surges it, and then it's designed to go down throughout the rest of the day. And then at night, we're designed to make melatonin, and then in the morning, it goes down. The typical pattern that I see these days, when someone is in maybe an early hyperglycemic state, it's high cortisol first thing in the morning, like waking up in the stressed out state all day long, maybe getting a little bit tired towards the evening, but oops, second wind, stressed out state, and can't fall asleep until midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, right? And that is typically an indication to me that they're definitely not blocking artificial light at night, because artificial light at night causes a secondary cortisol surge and suppresses melatonin. And then they're not getting that key peak happening because they're never signaling via light. They're only signaling via their stress, right? Mm-hmm. And light is the predominant signal that the body keys in on. And so if you can get that light signaling right, then that cortisol surge is basically what the body kind of pairs other surges with. It says, oh, here's sunrise. Yeah, Carrie's got a deadline, but we don't need to necessarily surge it like crazy because we already had our morning cortisol surge based on light signaling. And so that's an initial one that happens. But then at some point we get all these random surges that happen, especially at night, that will tank our sleep, right? And so then eventually the body says, I'm not going to make cortisol at all. That's stupid because I feel like garbage. I'm not getting the right amount of sleep. So it suppresses it via a pathway called the paraventricular nucleus, which is part of the brain, right? Part of the hypothalamus. And so that's when cortisol gets flatlined. Meaning at that point, we need to especially get outside in the morning as much as we can to stimulate. I have clients with adrenal fatigue also sync a cold face plunge with it because that also activates the paraventricular nucleus part of the brain. And so if you can do that regularly and then block the artificial light at night, it's beautiful. If people test their cortisol and melatonin curves, it's beautiful to see it all of a sudden come right back into alignment as opposed to flatline. And then sometimes cortisol for adrenal, the main fatigue, it's flatline, surge at night, that second wind at night, which again, that's artificial light at night. So this is all light dependent signaling, and that's never brought into the equation when it comes to talking about adrenal fatigue.
Yeah, that's so good. I started doing the face plunges and stuff for the oxytocin and just trying all the things, and that's really interesting. And I didn't know about that HPP axis, and so I have a client right now who has me a little stumped, and she had a surgery. She delivered and then had a hysterectomy and had a surgery, and I think there may have been something that impacted the stomach, which can cause for some people like dumping syndrome. So she's getting this like immediate like crash of the blood sugar, and it's staying super low, like hovering just above 50. And so I'm just, is it like she got an insulinoma has been ruled out, but I'm just kind of stumped with her because the fiber seems to be helping because it's sort of slowing that. But I'm also wondering, like, is her pituitary hyperactive? Like, is there something happening in the brain that's just causing, and for some people, just a hyper secretion of insulin? Like every time we eat, it's like, there's so much insulin. So I don't know if you have any ideas or feedback about that.
I I've only seen that in conjunction with TBI, but that's exactly what it was. It's a swelling of the pituitary, specifically all of the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, those communication pathways. And so I would almost like have her look up those pathways, or you look up the hormone pathways and be like, oh yeah, it's this one. She's experiencing symptoms of excessive amounts, or I'm sorry, diminished amounts of this one, or excessive amounts, right? And so if it's an anterior pituitary signaling issue, you'll oftentimes not only see it in just one pathway, you'll see it in multiple pathways.
Interesting. Okay, cool. I'll have to check that out, but that's really helpful. So thank you so much for being here. I could ask you another, couple hours worth of questions, but I feel pretty complete with, the information that you brought on today, and I really appreciate it. And you guys, this information is like, take it slowly. Don't let it overwhelm you. There's like big sciencey words, and we're talking about, it's like, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about an electron, since 8th grade. Like, but it's so cool to think that, okay, cool, we get a third of our energy from food, but there's all these other places, and there's a different way to hydrate our bodies and just create this really robust health. And so, yeah, thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you? I'm going to link everything below in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I'm so grateful for this conversation. This was so much fun. And yeah, simplify really quickly, just like morning light, good. Artificial light at night, block it, right? If that's where you start, it's a beautiful place to begin. And when I was first getting into learning this, I had to listen to lectures and things and podcasts over and over and over again. It'll sink in. It'll start to click, and you'll be like, "Oh my gosh!" So you can find me at carriebwellness.com. That's my home of my website. There, I've got 2 different sections. One is practitioner specific, and then the other one is a client specific. So lots of online courses. I'm launching some practitioner modules, and I've got a practitioner training that I co-teach through a certain quantum biology organization. And so you can get all that information there. And then if you just want to dig in a little bit more, like lighter, maybe Instagram would be a great place to go. Carrie B Wellness on Instagram. That's my home, and I try to do a post every single day. That's maybe not as overwhelming as this podcast might end up being.
No. I'm used to these terms now, and so I'm following better. But it does take some time for it all to sink in. So just be patient, But yeah, like you said, we can simplify. Just take away little bits. If your gym has a sauna, be in the sauna, like basic things, be in the sun, and then of course, don't get sunburned, work your way up, get all the different rays. And I'm, like we said, I'm working on my solar callus because I'm going to Costa Rica. So that's why I'm very tan right now, because I want to protect myself from the sun. And we didn't even talk about melanin. And you said that it sequesters heavy metals, and that just blew my mind. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so heavy metals and even oxidized iron and things like that people are worried about, right? So, I know, oxidized copper, oxidized iron. Yeah, it's a really cool molecule.
So cool. Love it. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here. Thanks for your time, and we'll have to get you back on soon.
Oh, I'd love to. Thanks for having me.